The first time my mother told me I should focus on marrying well instead of becoming a doctor. She said it like she was handing me a gift. Not an insult. Not a dismissal. Certainly not a theft. We were in the kitchen. Sunday afternoon. The roast still resting. My father outside with my brother, showing him how to back the car down the driveway, because apparently sons require ceremonial access to competence, while daughters are expected to absorb it silently through proximity. My mother stood at the counter slicing strawberries into a glass bowl and said, "You're pretty. Stella, you don't have to fight like Simon does." Then she smiled. That was the part that made it worse. Because women like my mother always package surrender like privilege. My name is Stella Bennett. The boy in the driveway being trained for importance before he had done anything difficult enough to earn it was my older brother. Simon. The woman in the kitchen gently redirecting my life away from medicine and toward social usefulness was my mother. Elaine. And 8 years later, when Simon showed up on the medicine floor of my hospital asking where to find the attending office, the first thing I noticed was that he still carried himself like our parents' investment had entitled him to land somewhere above me automatically. If this story reaches into something old in you, subscribe now. Some betrayals are not loud enough to get named while they're happening. They just reroute your future, so gradually that one day you look up and realize somebody else has been funded to become the version of you your family would only tolerate in a son. I grew up in Nashville, Tennessee, in a white brick house with black shutters. A manicured lawn my father cared about more than he admitted. And a kitchen that always smelled like coffee, bleach, and whatever my mother had turned into dinner 3 hours before she expected anyone to be grateful. From the street, we looked polished, respectable. The kind of family people described as successful because no one ever raised their voice where neighbors could hear. Inside, we specialized in allocation, attention, hope, money, permission. All of it moved through the family, according to a logic no one said plainly, because saying it plainly would have made it sound exactly as ugly as it was. My father, Richard Bennett, owned 2 dental supply franchises and believed deeply in outcomes that could be displayed. Good grades, good lawns, good schools, good sons. He liked expensive watches, folded newspapers, and being the kind of man other men asked for recommendations in hardware stores. My mother, Elaine, chaired charity committees, hosted tasteful dinners, and could turn almost any cruelty into something that sounded like social instruction if you gave her enough iced tea and an audience with manners. Then there was Simon, 2 years older than me. Broad shoulders early. Easy grin. The kind of boy teachers forgive before he is actually asked, because his face suggests eventual leadership and his mistakes still look, to adults, like draft versions of success. Simon was not evil. That matters. He was simply the child our family found easier to imagine as important. Important boys are expensive in houses like mine. But nobody calls it expense. They call it investment. I was the other kind of child. Precise. Good memory. Too serious. The daughter who brought home high grades without making the family look proud enough to justify what they cost. Because girls are supposed to be competent as background music, not as identity-shifting events. I learned that difference early. When Simon got a B+ in chemistry sophomore year, my father hired him a tutor by Tuesday. When I got an A- in AP biology, because I'd blanked on one section of the practical, my mother said, Perfectionism doesn't suit your face. That sentence tells you everything about the architecture I grew up in. Achievement in me was tolerated only if it stayed feminine, aesthetic, and non-threatening. I wanted medicine by 14. Not because of prestige. Because my grandfather had congestive heart failure. Because hospital corridors smell like disinfectant, burnt coffee, and panic pretending to sit quietly. Because the nurses on his floor seemed to understand a language my family didn't. The language where fear, exhaustion, data, timing, and kindness had to exist in the same body, without pretending not to touch. I liked that. I liked systems under pressure. I liked the idea that knowledge could lower a room's panic if it arrived with enough calm. I liked anatomy, pathophysiology, the way medicine rewarded stamina, structure, and exactness, all the things my family treated as useful in me, right up until they threatened to outrank their idea of what a daughter should ultimately be for. At 16, I started volunteering at a rehabilitation hospital, 3 Saturdays a month through a school health partnership. Mostly transport logs, filing, room prep, stocking gloves, and cleaning down equipment. Not glamorous, but I watched. Watched residents move too fast. Watched attendings choose words around fear. Watched nurses manage adult sons who had become children at the edge of their mothers' beds. And every single week I came home more certain. I wanted to be a doctor. Not adjacent. Not someday, maybe. Not if a husband's life made room for it. Mine. My father laughed the first time I said it aloud at dinner. Simon schmirkt. My mother set down her fork and said, "Well, let's not make life harder than it needs to be." That was her way. Never no in a form that could be quoted back to her cleanly. Always a softer reroute. A tidier diminishment. By 17, Simon had become the center of the family's educational orbit. He was bright enough. But more importantly, he wanted something my parents found socially flattering in exactly the right way. Dentistry first. Then pre-med by senior year, once he realized medicine sounded more impressive in rooms with donors and country club wives. My father loved that shift. It made him feel like he had produced a lineage, instead of just a son. Suddenly the house filled with test prep catalogs, campus tour planning, summer enrichment talk, MCAT pipeline conversations, long before Simon had earned the right to be discussed in future tense reverence. My mother started saying things like, "Medical families sacrifice a lot," even though no one had yet sacrificed anything except the kitchen table to brochure clutter. I was applying too. Quietly at first. Then, less quietly, once my counselor started helping me map real options. Scholarships. Pre-med tracks. Public universities with strong placement into med programs. One accelerated clinical science route with a rural health commitment that would cover most of my tuition if I kept my numbers high enough and survived the interview process. I did more than survive. I excelled. That was the problem. Not failure. Threat. If I had been mediocre, they could have stayed generous while dismissing me. But I was good. Really good. Top of my class. Strong scores. Faculty recommendations. A clinic supervisor who wrote that I had rare composure under stress and a systems-level mind unusual for this age. My father read that line at the dining room table one evening and said, "Composure is not the same thing as cutthroat." I looked at him. Medicine isn't just for cutthroat people. He folded the letter back into its envelope. "No," he said, "but that level of ambition has a cost." I almost laughed. Because by then I had already figured out that in my family, cost only becomes a moral argument when someone doesn't want to pay it for a daughter. When Simon wanted to attend an expensive summer science program in Chicago, my parents called it exposure. When I wanted to apply to a state university, honors pre-med track with a scholarship larger than his, my mother called it intensity. The summer before senior year, Simon got into Vanderbilt pre-med with partial family support and a level of celebration that made the house feel like election night. My father opened champagne. My mother called 4 relatives. My Aunt Nora brought a cake that said, "Future Dar. Bennett," in blue icing, as if language itself had already surrendered to his narrative. I sat in the kitchen that night, rinsing plates, while my parents and Simon laughed in the living room about dorm supplies and the kind of girls med students meet. My mother walked in. I saw me cleaning and said, "You're such a comfort in a house full of big personalities." I remember that exactly. Comfort. That was my assigned role. Not star. Not investment. Not risk worth taking. Comfort. The next week, I got my own letter. Crescent Ridge University. Honors pre-med. Major scholarship. Conditional research stipend after first year. Not just possible. Strong. Real. I took the packet home in my backpack and waited until dinner because some part of me stupid. Loyal. Still under construction, wanted the announcement to exist in the place where Simon's had mattered. The house smelled like baked chicken, rosemary, and lemon furniture polish. My father had one of his sales magazines open beside his plate. Simon was talking about apartment options off campus for sophomore year, which was hilarious given he had not yet survived a single midterm as the person the room had already made him into. I said, "I got into Crescent Ridge Honors pre-med." No one spoke. So I added, "They gave me a major scholarship." That changed the room. Not into joy. Into calculation. My father looked up first. Then my mother. Simon's face did something I still remember with strange gratitude. It tightened. Just slightly. Enough to prove he understood immediately what my acceptance meant. Not just that I'd gotten in, that I had gotten in on terms clean enough to expose every excuse they had prepared. My father reached for the packet. Read the front page. Turned to the scholarship letter. Then put it down as if holding it too long might create an obligation. "That's generous," he said. Generous. As if the school had indulged me. As if merit were pity wearing nice stationery. My mother smiled. "You should be very proud." Should be? No celebration. No cake. No relatives called from the kitchen. Just a sentence positioned carefully enough to sound gracious, while withdrawing anything that would have signaled equal investment. Then she added, "Now we can talk realistically." That phrase enters so many women's lives wearing a cardigan and carrying a knife. "What does that mean?" I asked. She looked at me as if the answer were obvious. "It means you have options. A strong science background can lead to so many wonderful paths." I stared at her. "I want medicine." My father cut in immediately. "Medicine costs money, even with scholarships." "So does Simon?" He looked annoyed by my tone, which in our family usually meant accurate. "Simon has a different profile." I waited. Sometimes the most useful thing a daughter can do is leave a silence big enough for the ugly sentence to finish dressing itself. My mother did it for him. Simon's more naturally suited to that world. She said, "You're bright, Stella, but in a different way." Different way. That phrase could fill cemeteries full of women's unlived lives. I asked, very calmly, "What way?" She smiled the way women smile when they think naming your limitation directly would be rude, even though structuring your life around it apparently isn't. "You're organized, warm, thoughtful. You'd be excellent in administration. Patient experience. Non-profit leadership." I laughed. I shouldn't have. But I did. A short, sharp sound. Because there it was. Every female-coded support role orbiting the center they had already reserved for my brother. My father put down his fork. "Don't get disrespectful." "I'm not being disrespectful." "Yes. You are." "No." I said, "I'm noticing." That sentence went over about as well as oxygen in a fire. Simon finally spoke. He leaned back, shrugged, and said, "It's not like they're saying you're dumb. They're just saying maybe doctor isn't your lane." Lane. There is no word I distrust more in family systems built on hierarchy. It always means the road has already been distributed, and someone better positioned would like you to stop standing in the middle asking why your sign points somewhere smaller. I looked at him. "And medicine is yours?" He gave me that little grin he used when adults were nearby enough to mistake him for playful. "I mean, come on. Come on." New argument. Just inherited confidence. That was the night my mother said, the line I would hear in my head for years. She reached across the table, touched my hand lightly like she was delivering mercy, and said, "You don't have to fight your way into a life like that. Sweetheart, you can marry well and still have a beautiful life." That sentence split my future in half. Not because it was new, because it was the first time she said it plainly enough to quote. I pulled my hand back. "I don't want to marry my way around my own brain." Simon actually laughed. My father didn't. He looked furious. Not because I'd been vulgar. Because I had taken the hidden architecture of the room and dragged it into spoken language. "You will watch your mouth," he said. My mother inhaled softly and entered her calmest tone, the one that meant the scene would later be rewritten around how hard I had made things. "We are trying to save you from a very hard life." I looked at both of them and understood something cleanly for the first time. They were not afraid I would fail. They were afraid I might survive the attempt well enough to make their investment choices look ideological instead of practical. "I'm applying," I said. My father leaned back in his chair. "With what money?" "Scholarships, loans, work." "Not from this house." I said nothing. He continued. "We are not splitting resources into two fantasy tracks." Fantasy. There it was. Simon's path equals funded future. Mine a fantasy. My mother, to her eternal credit or eternal indictment, never even pretended the split wasn't gendered once she got angry enough. "A son in medicine uplifts a family," she said. "A daughter in medicine gives away her best years to training and comes out too tired to have the life she was made for." I still remember the hum of the refrigerator after she said that. The little tick of cooling metal in the stove. The exact way my own heartbeat sounded in my ears. Because sometimes the line that changes your life is not shouted. It's simply stated too plainly to survive reinterpretation later. What if the life I was made for is mine? I asked. My father stood up. Dinner was over. That was how male finality worked in our house. Not reason. Movement. You can do what you want when you're out on your own, he said, but we are not funding a rebellion against common sense. I left the table. Not dramatically. Just because staying would have turned me into an audience member at the sentencing. That night, I sat on my bedroom floor with application papers spread around me and understood what the rest of my family had known long before I did. If I wanted medicine, I would have to stop treating my own future like something open for household debate. So I did. I applied everywhere that made financial sense. Took every interview. Worked every angle. Wrote every supplemental essay like the front door of my life depended on it. Because it did. I got in. 3 schools. 1 strong scholarship. 1 near full package if I committed to an underserved care track after residency. I was 18 when the final letter came. My mother did not cry. My father did not negotiate. They simply made the terms clear. If you choose this, my father said in the den with the television off and the air smelling faintly like leather furniture and old coffee. We are not paying for it, not backing it, and not cleaning up the mess when you come home in 2 years burned out and broke. My mother stood beside him and added, "You always make life harder than it needs to be." That one landed, because that had always been the family accusation against me. Not wrong. Difficult. As if wanting the whole size of my own life were an unnecessary inconvenience imposed on everyone else's comfort. I said yes to the school anyway. Packed in August. 2 suitcases. 3 boxes. 1 comforter my aunt had sent without knowing she was underwriting exile. Connor hugged me in the driveway and whispered, "Good luck." In the tone of a boy who already knew luck was the only language his neutrality could afford. Simon didn't come out. My father shook my hand. My mother stood in the doorway and said, "You can still change your mind." I looked at the house, at the people inside it, at the narrow shape of the life they had built for me that somehow still expected gratitude. And I said, "No, I'm just finally choosing it myself." College was difficult in exactly the ways rich families call character building when their own children are buffered from most of the actual damage. I worked constantly. Campus lab. Library desk. Tutoring. Weekend clinic filing. I ate cheap food. Wore old shoes too long. And learned how exhaustion settles differently in the body when it's mixed with the terror of financial precarity. But I also learned something else. Distance improves signal. The farther I got from my family's narration of me, the more obvious it became that I was not asking too much of life. I was simply asking it without permission. Distance improves signal. That was the first real gift college gave me. Not freedom. Not confidence. Clarity. Once I was far enough away from my family's daily interpretation of me, I could hear my own life with less static underneath it. I was still tired. Still broke. Still carrying too much on too little sleep. But I was no longer living inside a house where every ambitious choice had to survive cross-examination before breakfast. I majored in clinical sciences and pre-med blank Spurlecken. Worked harder than I had known. A human body could work without filing formal complaints. I tutored chemistry. Logged weekend hours in a student clinic. Took campus meal shifts one semester when the library cut hours. Learned how to stretch grocery money, rewear decent clothes, and pretend my stomach didn't drop every time tuition notices hit my inbox before aid disbursement cleared. Simon. Meanwhile, I did exactly what my parents had paid for him to do. He went to medical school on a smoother track. That matters. Not because he was lazy, because he was cushioned. There is a profound difference between equal talent under unequal support, and families like mine spend decades trying to blur that line, so outcomes look like pure merit. My parents paid for his apartment, his prep programs, his board review course, his emergency expenses. When I heard about it through Connor or an aunt or one of my mothers accidentally revealing little updates, I always noticed the language. Simon needs to stay focused. Simon has such pressure on him. Simon can't be distracted by money right now. Money, apparently, was a moral obstacle, only when it threatened the son they had already decided should represent the family publicly. When it threatened me, it was character building. I did not fail. That was the first shock to them. Not that I got through undergrad. That I got through well. Strong grades. Strong letters. Research. Clinical experience. Then medical school. Then one of the most satisfying moments of my 20s. Opening my first acceptance email at a folding table in the campus student center, while someone nearby microwaved soup badly and the whole room smelled like burnt cheese and stress. I got in. Not because anyone had made room for me. Because I had torn the room open myself. I told my parents by text. Not to punish them, because by then I no longer understood celebration as something routed through their house. My mother replied 3 hours later. Congratulations. I hope you've thought realistically about the next 4 years. That was the closest thing to enthusiasm she could survive while still protecting the old hierarchy. My father wrote, "Medical school is a different animal. Getting in is one thing. Finishing is another." That line sat with me for years. Not because it hurt, because it revealed him perfectly. He would rather remain available for my future collapse than surrender the comfort of being wrong in advance. Simon and I were in different medical systems by then, which helped. I didn't need his constant presence to understand the family comparison game was still active. I could hear it in my mother's voice when she called twice a year and asked about my studies in generalities, but knew the precise status of Simon's rotations, board scores, and faculty mentors. "How's school?" she would ask me. Then, 10 minutes later, "Simon's surgery attending says he has real instinct." Instinct. That word gets handed to sons the way discipline gets handed to daughters, as if both arrived from heaven, instead of being socially rehearsed through years of who was trusted first. Medical school itself was exactly what people outside medicine imagine, only if they hate you. Cadavers. Fluorescent light. Caffeine breath. Humiliation as pedagogy. The smell of formalin and library, carpeting and stale coffee and tired ambition. There were weeks my body felt like a borrowed instrument. I had no right to keep pushing. Still, I loved it. Not every day. Not every lecture. Certainly not every attending. But enough. Enough that even on the worst night's anatomy practicals, failed procedures, study panic, the ugly, intimate grief of first patient losses during clerkships, I never once wanted the smaller life my mother had offered in her kitchen as a kindness. That mattered more than anyone in my family would ever fully understand. Medicine wasn't just the path I chose. It was the proof that I had not misread myself. Simon became a doctor too. That is important. He did not fail into obscurity or implode at the first hard exam and hand me easy emotional victory. He became what he had been funded and favored to become: competent. Decent enough in rooms with authority. Still slightly overconfident in the way men often remain when the world has not charged them enough for being average in the right places. He went into internal medicine because it was broad, respectable, and still left room for prestige if you learned how to speak like your own effort had been destiny. I went into internal medicine because I understood systems under pressure and cared about what bad structure does to actual bodies. Those are not the same relationship to the same specialty. He ended up in a private track residency affiliated with one of the hospitals my father loved to name drop. I matched into a grittier university program with heavier patient load, weaker furniture, smarter nurses, and just enough institutional neglect to teach me the difference between reputation and medicine. That was where I became dangerous. Not glamorous. Dangerous. Because once a woman like me survives enough nights on a service that runs half on competence and half on prayer, she stops mistaking pedigree for authority. Residency stripped everyone down. Your face changes in residency. So does your spine. I learned which interns collapsed under charting and which ones hid panic behind swagger. I learned how to speak to family members in the exact 30 seconds before a room turned. I learned how to fix scheduling disasters, catch medication issues, calm escalating interns, and survive the weird emotional weather of medicine where brilliance and fragility share lockers, and everyone still has to round by 7. I became very good. Again, not effortlessly. That matters. I got good because systems reveal themselves to people who watch long enough, and because for years I had been raised inside another system, a family one, that distributed value unequally while pretending it was about suitability. Once you understand one hierarchy deeply, you start seeing all the others faster. By chief year, I was the resident. Other residents came to before they went to attendings for certain kinds of problems. Not because I was the loudest, because I was reliable under pressure and clear when the room got stupid. That is authority too. Though it looks nothing like what my father admired in men. The hospital network expansion happened during my final training years. One merged campus, then another. Then a new internal medicine leadership track tied to a large public-facing workforce redesign in Nashville. New donor money, new staffing, new resident intake, new administrative chain. Too much optimism in slide decks. Not enough respect for transition fatigue. The sort of institutional change that creates opportunities for people willing to do real work while everyone else congratulates themselves at podiums. I got recruited in because one of my supervising attendings trusted me. That still moves me when I say it plainly. Not family. Not legacy. Not a father's contacts. Not a mother's dinner party alliances. A physician who watched me work and thought, yes, here. The offer placed me in a hybrid role right at the edge of education and authority internal medicine service operations, plus supervising responsibilities, plus onboarding oversight for a transitional cohort of new residents, and hospitalists rotating through the new wing. In ordinary language, I would be the person people reported to before they embarrassed themselves higher up. I accepted. Not because of revenge, because it was the right job. That distinction matters. Revenge became useful later. The job was already mine on its own merit. I moved back to Nashville at 32. Rented a townhouse 10 minutes from the hospital with terrible kitchen lighting and one perfect maple tree out front that turned obscene shades of red in October. Noah moved with me 6 months later after we'd done the adult long-distance thing for long enough to prove we weren't just romanticizing competence in one another. He was an engineer. Calm. Funny in the driest possible way. The kind of man who hears a bad family story and asks what pattern it repeated instead of what everyone should have felt. I loved him for many reasons. One of them was that he never confused my ambition with an invitation to manage it. When I told him Simon had also matched into internal medicine years earlier, he just nodded and said, "So eventually the system will test your family myth against actual organizational charts." I laughed so hard I startled the dog. He wasn't wrong. What none of us expected was how literal that would become. It happened on a Tuesday in August. New cohort intake day. Bad coffee in the conference room. Too many lanyards. That institutional smell of printer toner. Fresh badges. Stale carpet. And overconfident optimism. I had the onboarding list on a clipboard and was mentally preparing to explain. For the 12th time, why no? No one gets custom call schedules in week 1. When I looked down at the transfer roster and saw his name, Dr. Simon Bennett, hospitalist transition intake, internal medicine service. I stared at the page long enough for one of the admin coordinators to ask if anything was wrong. I said no. Then read it again. There are moments when life is subtle. This wasn't one. I already knew from family whispers that Simon's previous arrangement had not ended cleanly. Too much ego. Not enough fit. Some language about restructuring an opportunity that translated, if you had lived around men long enough, into things had not gone the way he expected, and the story had been polished for transport. Still, I had not imagined this. Not just same city. Same system. Same service line. Under my operational oversight. Noah was the first person I told. He listened, then asked, "Do you want him reassigned?" I thought about it and said no. Not because I wanted spectacle. Because this was not spectacle. This was structure. If the hierarchy was real, there was no need to hide it. He kissed my forehead and said, "Then make him meet you where the paperwork already has." That sentence became my strategy. The orientation room filled slowly. New white coats, anxious smiles, old leather shoes trying to look less scared than their owners. The usual mix of confidence, sleep debt, and the strange temporary equality medicine creates before real competence starts sorting itself again. Simon walked in 6 minutes late. Of course he did. He still had that same easy athletic posture our parents had always translated as leadership before evidence. Older now. Leaner through the face. Better haircut. More expensive watch. The sort of doctor who looked good in donor brochures and probably knew it. He scanned the room casually, then saw me at the front. Clipboard. Name badge. Service leadership folder in hand. The exact second recognition landed. His whole body changed. Not dramatically. That's the thing. Real humiliation in adults often looks like stillness before it looks like expression. He stopped, then kept walking. Because everyone in the room was watching, and men like Simon learn early how to keep public surfaces polished even while their internal architecture is cracking. I smiled politely. The same smile I used on interns, vendors, and anxious attendings who hadn't read their own emails properly. "Dr. Bennett," I said. "Just formal enough? Just public enough?" He nodded once. "Stella." No sister. No warmth. Good. The room had already answered the important question. He knew where he was. I went through the orientation exactly as planned. Service structure. Reporting flow. Escalation protocols. Documentation. Expectations. Who signs what? Who routes what? Who takes what to me before it becomes somebody else's problem? Every time I said the phrase "my office" or "run that by me first," or "I'll be signing off on those transitions," I could feel the atmosphere around Simon tightening by increments, so small no one else would have named them. But I did. Because I'd spent my whole life studying what happened to men when structure finally outranked charm. After the session, he waited until the room had mostly cleared. Then approached with a half smile. The old one. The one meant to make everything feel like we were both above the tension, if I would just do the feminine labor of joining him there. Didn't expect this? He said. I stacked the onboarding folders. No. He glanced at my badge. Then back at me. So you're running this? There it was. Not congratulations. Not you did it. Verification of authority first. I'm overseeing service transition and resident operations for the wing. I said, your onboarding questions go through me. The smile tightened. Right. Then he added, in that breezy tone men use when trying to reframe disadvantage as coincidence. Small world. No, that is what people say when they are desperate to make consequence sound random. I looked at him and said, not really. He held my gaze for a second and, to his credit, at least had the self-awareness not to ask what I meant in a room where any answer would have left a mark. The family fallout began before the week ended. Of course it did. Family systems have a supernatural ability to detect when reality has rearranged a hierarchy they had hoped was permanent. My mother called Thursday evening. I had just come home. The dog was scratching uselessly at the back door. Noah was making pasta. The kitchen smelled like garlic, olive oil, and the good kind of ordinary life. Stella, she said. Her voice had that careful sweetness she only used when she was trying to cross a room without admitting it contained broken glass. Simon mentioned you two are in the same hospital now. There it was. Not you're in leadership. Not how extraordinary. Not I'm proud. Just same hospital now. As if we'd both happened to wander into the same airport lounge. Yes. A pause. Then, I hope you'll make this easy. That sentence told the whole story in 6 words. Not fair. Not professional. Iasi. Meaning, protect his ego, absorb the awkwardness, flatten the truth until the family can still breathe. I laughed once. Not loudly. Noah looked over from the stove and already knew from my face what category of call this was. Easy for who? I asked. Silence. Then the sigh. My mother's sighs had always contained whole essays about my disappointing refusal to make my own pain socially convenient. For everyone? She said. That was when I knew nothing had changed at the root. Only the vocabulary. I'm not doing anything to him. I said, I'm doing my job. You know what I mean? Yes. I said, that's the problem. That was the first crack. Not the confrontation later. The first crack. Because for once, I refused to translate her euphemism back into comfort. She tried my father next. Not because he was better. Because weak men are useful when strong women need a messenger who can still pretend to be neutral. He called Saturday afternoon. Football on in the background. His voice already carrying the tired weight of a man who wanted the conflict handled without having to say whose choices created it. Simon's in a difficult position. I stood in the laundry room holding a warm towel I'd forgotten to fold and said, "He's in orientation." "That's not what I mean." "Of course not." I leaned against the dryer. "What do you mean?" He took too long. That told me enough already. It's just, people know you're above him there. Above him. Not same level. Not peers. Not both doing well. Above. I almost smiled. Because sometimes your parents tell the truth only when they're most upset by its existence. Yes. I said, "That's how the org chart works." He exhaled sharply. "You don't have to make this into something." There it was again. The family accusation always leveled at daughters like me. The thing is already happening. But my refusal to pretend otherwise is somehow what makes it real. I didn't. I said, "You did that years ago?" He got quiet. And that is where part 1 becomes part 2 inches, the emotional sense too. Because after that call, I understood the real climax would not be Simon reporting to me. It would be my parents having to watch it happen without me softening the edges. Type karma. If you think some families only respect your path after the payroll system does. Not because titles heal childhood. Because institutional truth is harder for biased parents to relabel as attitude. The first month went better than Simon expected. That bothered him. Not because I mistreated him. Because I didn't. I was precise. Professional. Fair. No favors. No punishments. No side-channel mercy disguised as sibling grace. Which meant he had to sit in something much harder than open conflict, legitimate hierarchy. I corrected documentation. Returned 1 discharge summary with comments. Made him reroute a transition plan that skipped 2 protocol requirements and put a fragile patient at risk. Nothing dramatic. Just ordinary authority applied accurately. That is the thing men raised like Simon rarely see coming. They expect either female softness or female pettiness. What destabilizes them is female competence with no emotional leakage at all. He adapted. Mostly. Not gracefully. But enough. Then came the donor dinner. Not the one that introduced the wing. A later one. Smeller. Department linked. The kind of semi-public professional event my parents loved because it let them orbit prestige without needing credentials of their own. They were invited through Simon. Of course. By then, they knew exactly where I sat in the structure. Connor had told them. Simon had certainly told them. Though I'm sure in language designed to preserve a little narrative dignity around how temporary or technical or organizational it all was. That evening I wore a dark green dress, and my white coat stayed in the office because the event was after service hours. Still, the authority was in the room before I was. Everyone knew who had organized transition systems. Everyone knew whose service metrics were being praised. Everyone knew who department leadership kept pulling into little half circles of serious conversation. My parents arrived 20 minutes late. My father in a navy suit. My mother in muted gold. Simon with them? And the moment they saw me speaking with the chief of medicine and 2 board members under a hospital donor wall with my badge still clipped at my waist, I watched a decade of family logic experience, oxygen deprivation. My mother recovered first. Of course she did. She walked over, smiling that same old smile. Women like her use when the social room is large enough to require immediate costume changes. Stella. There you are. I turned. And because sometimes the greatest revenge is refusing to help people enter the version of you they belatedly prefer, I said, pleasantly, yes, I work here. That line landed exactly where it needed to. My father gave that short, uneasy laugh men use when they realize two women in a room know more about what is happening than they do. Simon said nothing. Good. My mother touched my arm lightly. Your father and I are so impressed by everything Simon says you've built. No. There it was again. Even here. Even now. Even in front of donors and doctors, and a room that knew the hierarchy already. She still tried to route my accomplishment through the sun. Everything Simon says. Not what we see. Not what you did. Not what we misjudged. No. His language as passport. I looked at her hand on my arm. Then back at her face. And removed it gently. Interesting. I said, because none of you wanted to fund it. That sentence ended the evening. Not literally. The wine kept circulating. The event continued. But the family version of the room ended right there. My father looked down. Simon's jaw tightened. And my mother, my beautiful, careful, socially fluent mother, froze for 1 second too long before saying, "That's not fair." There is no word more useful than fair when it finally changes sides. Exactly. I said, that was the real climax. Not a scream. Not a public collapse. Just the room, for once, having to hold the weight of the right word. I did not stay with them after that. I turned back toward my colleagues and the donor wall and the ordinary, earned life I had built without their money, without their blessing, and certainly without their permission to become the wrong kind of daughter. Later that night, after the guests thinned and Noah drove us home through warm city streets with the windows cracked, I cried. Not because I regretted anything, because some victories still ache in the places childhood originally carved out for tenderness. Noah didn't say much. He never did when language would have turned good pain into performance. He just parked, came around to my side, and held me in the driveway, while the porch light caught moths and the dog barked himself hoarse behind the door. "You okay?" he asked. I laughed softly into his shirt. "No," I said. Then, after a breath, "Yes." That was the truth. The aftermath was quieter than I expected. My father called first, not to defend himself. "That surprised me," he said, in the careful, tired voice men use when they've spent too much of their lives standing slightly behind the stronger wrong person. "I did know you were good enough." I sat at my desk the next evening with charts still open and said, "That somehow makes it worse." He was silent. Then, "Yes." That mattered. Not enough, but it mattered. Because for the first time in my adult life, he answered truth with truth instead of management. My mother took longer. 3 weeks. Then an email. Polished. Painful. Full of language like misunderstanding. Wanting the best. Different realities for sons and daughters back then. And proud of what you have become. I read it twice. Then answered with 4 sentences. "You did not misunderstand me. You ranked me. You funded my brother's confidence and called my ambition impractical. Any future relationship we have will begin with that truth. She did not reply for 11 days. Then one line. I need time to think. I laughed when I read it. Not because it was funny. Because women like my mother always discover the value of time only after they lose the right to use certainty as a shortcut. Simon changed the least. That also mattered. People love stories where the sibling villain breaks first. Real life is lazier than that. Simon didn't become monstrous under me. He also didn't become suddenly noble. He adjusted to the org chart the way privileged men often do when faced with undeniable structure, reluctantly. Professionally, and with just enough resentment left alive to explain later why the situation had been complicated. 3 months in, after I corrected him in a meeting on a patient flow call, he caught me in the hallway and said, "You don't have to make it a point every time." I looked at him. "What point?" He hesitated. There it was. The old family assumption. That accountability delivered by a sister must contain surplus emotion even when it's just accountability. "This," he said finally, "us." I held his gaze, then said the truest sentence I had. There was never an us in the version of the future Mom and Dad paid for. He went very still. Didn't answer. Didn't apologize. Just stood there long enough for the sentence to land in whatever chamber of his body still housed the boy at our parents' table laughing, while my life got scaled down as a kindness. He became more careful after that. Not warmer. Better. Sometimes that is enough. Connor, interestingly, changed the most. Maybe because men raised on the easy side of family hierarchy need more time than everyone else to realize the floor beneath them was not neutral ground. He called more, asked real questions, came to lunch without pretending. Sports talk was a personality. Once he said, "While stabbing at hospital cafeteria pasta, no one should legally call food. I used to think you were intense. Now I think you were just the only one taking yourself seriously before anybody gave you permission." That may be the nicest thing my brother has ever said to me. We are not sentimental now, but we are real. And real is worth more. As for me, I stayed. Not in the family house. Not in their narrative. At the hospital. In the work. In the life that fit not because someone approved of my suitability, but because I had built it under pressure, and it still held. 2 years later, I moved into a bigger leadership role. 3 years later, Noah and I married. My mother cried at the wedding in the very controlled way women like her cry when they are not sure whether the room reads them as moved or judged. My father looked at me during the vows with an expression I still don't know how to categorize cleanly. Pride. Perhaps. Regret. The strange grief of watching the adult daughter you once diminished become someone whole enough not to need your revised language later. Simon came alone. Stayed polite. Left early. That felt right. People sometimes ask whether outranking my brother healed anything. No, healing is not a promotion. But it clarified things beautifully. My parents paid for my brother's medical school but told me to marry well instead. 8 years later, he started working under me at the hospital. People hear that sentence and think the revenge is in the hierarchy. It isn't. The revenge is in the proof. The proof that I was never asking for too much. Only asking in a house that had already decided daughters should convert their gifts into support roles, while the sons got futures with price tags attached. The revenge is that Simon's authority was funded, and mine was forged. And forged authority does something inherited confidence never quite learns how to do. It lasts under pressure. If this story stayed with you, subscribe before you go. There are more of us than anyone admits. Daughters told to be realistic, while the family bankrolls a brother's grander version of the same dream. Women whose ambition was treated as attitude until a title forced the room to change grammar. Sisters who had to learn late that being underestimated is painful. But being right anyway can still become a life. And if that's you, remember this. You do not need the people who rerouted your path to validate the destination after you arrive. Sometimes the strongest ending is simple. They invested in him. You built yourself. Then one day the badge, the office, the reports, and the room itself made the difference impossible to mispronounce.